So here today with us, we've got Harry Stevenson from Ghost, and he's going to be talking about indie versus AAA. So over to you, buddy.
Thank you. So the talk I'm going to be giving today is about my experiences of starting and running an indie games company versus now working in AAA. So I'm hoping to maybe give some insight for people who are looking to enter the games industry, not quite sure what they want to do yet, or people who are already in the games industry thinking about a switch, or maybe switching from indie to AAA or vice versa. So hopefully that will just that's kind of what I want to get out of this talk. Bear in mind, this is just my experience. So this is the indie company that I started and ran, or co-started and ran, and my AAA. Your mileage may vary. Different people have different experiences, but that's kind of all the caveats I wanted to give. Also, I have no idea how long this is going to take. I was meant to start a timer and I didn't. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, feel free to just stop me during, because there may be time for questions at the end and there may not. So just to start out, I wanted to do sort of a brief who am I, or hopefully brief, just to kind of explain and add some context to where my experiences come from. So I'm Harry. Hello, everyone. I'm 27 years old and I am a software engineer / DevOps engineer at Ghost Games, which is an Electronic Arts studio. So I grew up in Wokingham. That was where I was born, lived, grew up. Tried to do some research, get an interesting fact. There are none. It's a boring place. Don't bother visiting. I sort of did okay at school, got my GCSEs, sort of B's and C's. I wasn't an amazing student. Went to college. Didn't do traditional A-levels. Ended up doing a BTEC in computing and IT, which I know, again, maybe not the most traditional routes. And I did okay, but not a model student by any stretch. So I lived there for 18 years. And then after that, I was looking at kind of university courses to go to. I knew I enjoyed programming. So as I mentioned before, I'm a software engineer. So I started looking at programming courses, and I figured maybe I can add a more interesting twist to this. So I looked at games programming courses and found myself in Stafford. Specifically, so this university, but in the old campus that is now shut down for anyone who doesn't already know. So that's it in the bottom corner there. And I studied computer games programming here. I did a 4-year degree with a 1-year placement. So that was so you do your first 2 years. I went and did a placement year and then came back and then graduated with a 2-1. So I'm hoping that all of this sort of context is sort of let you know I was an acceptable student. I graduated. I did what I needed to do, but I was never amazing. So also my placement year, I worked at a company called OpsView for 16 months. That was quite a small company. There's about 25 people when I joined. It ended up about 40 people. So it grew, while I was there. It was actually a really interesting place to work because it felt a bit like an indie. They were an established company, but they were still quite small. There was a lot of responsibility, a lot of personal responsibility. And even though I was an intern there, it felt like I was kind of a real member of the team and had a lot of trust. So that was what I did there. So kind of I finished my degree. I was like, what do I want to do next? Wasn't really sure. And I was actually really lucky. So one of the lecturers who's still here, Paul Roberts, ended up going to a talk that happened at this university, but that I wasn't part of, for a program that was going on down in Falmouth. So this was what I ended up doing next. By the end of my degree, I had no idea what I wanted to do, and this sort of came along right at the end, and I applied and got in. So it was all a bit of a rush. So I moved down to Falmouth, and I started something called the Launchpad program, which is formerly Alacrity. So the concept behind this course was, if you take 20 people who have graduated from university, they've done games-related courses, programmers, artists, animators, production roles, things like that, and you put them into teams of 4, and you wrap them with a load of business support and say, here's how you sort of start and run a business, and you entice them in with a master's in entrepreneurship and a stipend, so it's sort of essentially like getting paid, then you can kind of convince people to come and take this risk by taking some of the risk out of it. So I did this. I joined this master's in Falmouth, and we started a business named Burning Arrow. So this was the indie company that I started and ran. It was supported by the university, but ultimately there was me, 3 other students, and we started this business. And I lived in Falmouth, did that for a year, and then I stayed in Falmouth for a year and a half afterwards, running my company, Burning Arrow, from down there. So before I move on to Burning Arrow, just wrap up my kind of who am I. So after my time in Falmouth, I moved back up to Wokingham, where I started and grew up. We kept working at Burning Arrow for about 6 months. It didn't quite work out, as indie companies sometimes don't. We were about 3 years in. So I joined EA. I started on an 8-month contract in May 2017. It kind of got extended out. When it became obvious that I was going to be working there for a while, I moved to Guildford. And then a few months after that, I went permanent at EA. Something I wanted to call out on this slide is that I started as a contractor. I think that's, at least in my experience, quite a common route into the games industry. Companies will take you on as a contractor, almost as an extended trial period to see how you get on. Some companies do it so that they can scale down after projects. At EA, that doesn't tend to be true, but certainly the games industry, that first job, that first contract role, it maybe won't be the most stable. This isn't universally true, but in my experience, it's tended to be the route. And I'm still at EA, and I'm very much enjoying it. So I'm an EA boy now. So back to the company that I started. So this is where my indie experience comes from. Almost all of my indie experience is kind of centered around my time starting, building, or attempting to build this company. So Burning Arrow was incorporated in September of 2015. It's initially 4 of us. So it was 2 software engineers, myself being one of them, an animator and a character artist. But to suggest, for anyone who knows much about indie companies, to suggest that those are the roles that we did in the company would be pretty wrong. I definitely was developing software, but I was also I was doing ops, I was doing build engineering, doing all kinds of things that you basically have to do when you work in an indie company. There's very, very few people who work for indie companies and are able to just focus in on their one area. So a lot of my time at Burning Arrow was spent doing all kinds of things, really, like director's duties, business plans, finances, pitching, huge amounts of pitching. If you're running an indie company, if you're trying to start up and you're trying to get your indie company out the door, you are going to spend probably more than almost anything else you do. You're going to be out there, you're going to be pitching your game, you're going to be giving elevator pitches, you're going to be trying to get people to invest in you, to publish your game, trying to get them to just put you in front of their audiences. Pitching is probably the single biggest thing I spent my time on. And you're going to be going out to expos and stuff, hopefully, if you can afford it as well. So we, at Burning Arrow, at our peak, we got up to 12 people. As you can see there, we added a load of people, some audio composers, animators, 3D artists. Our peak, full production, there was 12 people in the studio working on our first and only game. We were quite lucky. We managed to get investment through an investment firm. This wasn't a game specialized investment firm. This is just a company that invests in tech, health, all kinds of industries. Managed to convince them to put some money into us on a straight cash for equity deal. We also managed to get some additional funding through a group called Creative England, who do a thing called Green Shoots. So this is something that's, if you're starting a games company, something that's really worth looking out for. There's a lot of these types of things that exist where you can get additional funding from government-backed groups or other of these kind of groups. So Creative England do a deal where if you've got investment and you want some extra money, they'll match some of your investment on a loan that's repayable, but only when you're selling games. So they can't just call this loan back in. It's not money that you have to start paying back immediately. There's no interest on it. But when you start selling, a fraction of every game goes back to repaying the loan. So Burning Arrow, overall, our funding was in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. That's kind of how much we had to make our game. So I was going to show a video of the game, but I'm not going to bother. So that was Burning Arrow. Actually, I will briefly talk. So The Other 99 was the game that we made. So this was a first-person action survival game. In a lot of ways, it was kind of similar to the sort of PUBG format. 100 people on an island, fight to the death. We had a decision early on to make, do we go down the multiplayer route or do we go down the AI route? And we picked AI, thinking, okay, we'll make this more of a story game. And then PUBG came and released a year after we did and proved that we'd made the worst decision we could have possibly made. Should have made it online. PUBG, it would have been us. But anyway, so something that was fantastic about this game, as is true if you've ever tried to get your mates to play PUBG, it's incredibly easy to pitch a battle royale, 100-man standing on an island, 100-man last man standing on an island is an incredibly easy game to pitch. That is phenomenally helpful when you're building things like marketing materials and pitching materials, if you're trying to get your game off the ground. Cool. So, as mentioned, I now work for Ghost Games. So we're an EA studio based out of Guildford. So, when it became clear that Burning Arrow wasn't going the way we'd hoped, I joined Ghost, so May of 2017. In that time, I've shipped one game, Need for Speed Payback, which we shipped November of the same year that I joined. So I came in, it was a bit of a whirlwind, sort of joined the team, did a little bit of development, and then was straight into like bug fixing, get this game ready to ship. It was a big ask. So I joined as an online engineer. That means connected and asynchronous features. That's not direct multiplayer, but it's more like leaderboards, matchmaking, partying, all the stuff that doesn't sound particularly glamorous, but if you want to ship on a Microsoft or a Sony platform, you have to do because they will not let you do it otherwise. So after I joined, a few months after I joined, I mentioned to my manager that I had some Linux and some field experience and IT experience, and it turned out someone was actually leaving the company from a similar role. So I actually transitioned into that role and became an ops/DevOps engineer, which at Ghost Games means I'm looking after metrics and monitoring of game servers and the client services that we provide, deploying game servers, looking after tooling and sort of back-end things that people use for developing our games. So this will obviously be mentioned a lot by a lot of different people, but networking is always super, super key, and I got this job through networking. Someone I met during my Burning Arrow days recommended me for the job, and that's how I ended up at Ghost. So Ghost is a smallish for AAA studio, size studio, so we're about, I don't actually know how many people it is, but in comparison to like a lot of other, we're much smaller than like DICE for Battlefield, but we're certainly bigger than like Hellblade, for instance. Something that's quite cool about our studio is that we're distributed across 3 locations. So we have Guildford, where I work, we have Bucharest in Romania, and Gothenburg in Sweden is our lead studio. And so we do a lot of remote working. So that's something that was kind of different from indie, where we were sort of managing a small number of people, and most of them were in-house. With AAA, what you'll often find, even if you're a single site studio, you'll still have peripheral teams and lots of people you need to deal with outside. It ends up being a huge communication task. So Ghost as a studio have shipped 3 titles: Need for Speed Rivals, Need for Speed 2015, and Need for Speed Payback. And I was going to show a video of that, but I'm not going to do that either. Cool, so title of the presentation is Indie versus AAA. So probably makes sense to have a slide that talks about, at least from my point of view, what Indie and AAA are. So I stole these off Wikipedia. Shamelessly, but I think they're relatively accurate. And in my view, kind of building upon what's there, an indie game or an indie studio is a studio that is largely self-funded. They don't have a significant financial backing from, say, a publisher. There's not the too big to fail factor. So kind of conversely, AAA is these studios typically have a huge publisher behind them. The amount of money that we pumped into things like marketing, things that are even peripheral to development, will be there'll be so much money there that basically these games can't fail. And that is kind of where I think the distinction lies. They'll be hedging their bets a lot more. Cool. So this is kind of now getting into some of the differences that I've seen or that I've felt in my experiences, bearing in mind this is running, not just working for an indie company, versus the AAA I now work in. So personal development. This may not be such an obvious one when you think, I'm going to run my company, I'm going to be the boss. That's a great thing to do, but when you're wanting to move your career forward, when you're wanting to step up, in indie, that route forward makes a lot less sense. You're already the boss. What's your next step? How do you keep stretching yourself? How do you keep progressing? How do you feel like there's that sense of achieving? And you can get those things from elsewhere, sure, by shipping games and sales and things like that. But that sense of kind of having people above you who are more senior than you can lean on, it doesn't really exist as much in indie. So certainly at Burning Arrow, I was the most senior programmer, and now I was essentially straight out of university. So conversely, in Ghost Games, the first day 1, I had a mentor. I had someone who sits behind me, still sits behind me. He's not even in my team anymore, but he's a senior engineer. And when I'm struggling, when I have a problem with something, with the work I'm doing, or just the right way to approach something, I've got that mentorship, and it's just built into the fabric of the studio. You will almost always have someone more senior than you who you can bounce ideas off, you can talk to about the ways to approach problems. That's certainly something that's very, very different. So there may not be anyone more senior than you in indie. There's certainly unlikely to be someone more senior than you in your craft. So, bouncing ideas off someone's one thing, learning from like a senior. So for me, my craft being programming, having someone above me who can be like, actually, no, that's a bad way of writing that code. That's coding style is wrong. Teaching you those things that are hard earned from years in the industry. In indie, they don't tend to be there. Unless you can go and afford to hire someone who's senior in your role who can teach you, you're going to be on your own. You're going to be doing research. You're going to be trying to find ways to level up that are kind of separate from the sort of more traditional routes. And the final point on here is that if something's too hard in indie, you're still on your own. As mentioned, like if you're looking at a problem, you're like, I'm just not equipped to deal with this. Well, you better find a way to deal with it because you're that's there really. Whereas in AAA, you can go and approach a senior. You can hand things off entirely. This is certainly something that happened to me. It was something that was quite tough for me to start with, but it's something I'm kind of getting more comfortable with. That you get a problem, you work on it, you take it as far as you possibly can. But at some point, maybe that problem's just slightly beyond you at the moment, and there's no shame in admitting that and handing that off to someone more senior. That certainly happens, and at AAA, the support structure exists for that. So career progression, this is something I kind of touched on in the last slide. So those step-ups. You're not going to go from being a director of a business to being a director of a business, senior director. Like it doesn't. If you run the company, you own the company. Where's your next step? You're already at the ceiling. So whereas in AAA, there tends to be kind of structured career progression. Certainly at EA, we have this tiering system: software engineer 1, 2, 3, senior software engineer, and you tick all the boxes, and you're up. And as long as you can tick all the boxes that say I can move up, then you'll put you up for promotion, and potentially you'll get promoted. So the other thing about this whole about career progression is in AAA you're more likely to be focused, and you're going to be like an AI engineer or a gameplay engineer or a character artist, and you can level up in that area, and you can really focus down on becoming the best of that specific thing. But in indie you're going to have to, as mentioned before, wear a lot of different hats. And so again, if you're trying to level up that one area, you're not going to have as much time to do it because you need to be able to do marketing to support the business. You need to be able to write business plans. You need to be able to pitch. So it's kind of great in some respects. You get a much, much broader range of knowledge and experiences, but your single track progression is certainly going to be slowed down by that. So if that's something you're concerned about, if you want to be the best character artist you can be, then just be aware that in an indie studio, you may be expected to go outside of that and go and try new things. So the networks you build. Again, this is something that wasn't obvious to me at all. Something I mentioned earlier on. I got my job because of networking. But when you work in an indie studio, the networks that or certainly when you run an indie studio, the networks you build, the people you're going to be interacting with are just fundamentally different. If you're expecting to get jobs from these people to put you forward for jobs and things like that later on, these are the people that are going to be way above dev teams. They're going to be, you're talking to people who can help market your game, people who might invest in you, people who might be willing to publish your game. And kind of the end goal of your networking is typically to develop your business. That's what you're thinking. That's what's at the back of your mind. How can I get my business leveled up? Whereas with AAA, it's, at least in my experience, a lot more relaxed than that. I go out to game dev meetups and things like that because I just want to meet new people. I want to learn from them. I want to build those networks of people that I could kind of consider my friends and people that I could lean on if I was ever looking for another job in the games industry. It's a very, very different experience, and I think the indie one tends to be a lot higher pressure. You're on your game a lot more, even in your own time. As soon as you meet someone in a pub and you hear, oh, I work in, I'm a marketer. You switch on like that, and you're like, okay, cool. Can I, is this a potential useful contact for me? I think that makes a huge difference. So creative freedom is probably an obvious one that people will often talk about. In indie, you will tend to have more freedom. Certainly if you're running an indie company, you're likely to have more creative freedom, but that comes at a cost. When you make a decision in an indie product, you're going to have to potentially live with that decision. That decision might ship. You might make a kind of a decision on a whim, and that ends up in the final game. Kind of an example of that in our game, The Other 99, I was experimenting with a weather system. I got something off the asset store, I was playing around with it, I put it in, and it had a day-night cycle, and it was turned on by default. I hadn't turned it off, and the other guys saw it, and that was kind of what we had in the build at the time. Somebody else saw it externally and said, "Oh, cool, the game has a day-night cycle." And then the game had a day-night cycle, and we were sort of stuck with the decision. It wasn't something we deliberately did, but those decisions have knock-on effects. There's less people looking over your shoulder, making sure, "Oh, hey, have you taken that thing out of the build? Have you turned that off? Have you made sure that's gone through design first?" that freedom comes with a responsibility. So the other side of a big difference between the indie and AAA thing in terms of decision making is that the plus side is you can change things quickly and you can communicate that out. Something that's often missed in AAA is that if you're working in a 100-man team across multiple sites and you make a decision that changes the way the game works, you need to communicate that out to 100 people, 200 people, whatever that may be. You need to get them all into a meeting. You know, that meeting has a cost. It's the cost of all of those people's time for that period. There's the cost of what if someone misses it and keeps working off the old system or the old design. When you make decisions in AAA, they're not just more significant because you've done more upfront design work. They're more significant because it is so much more difficult to spread that information out effectively and to cope with all the repercussions and all the ways that those decisions can ripple into other systems within the game. So yes, indie does tend to have more creative freedom. AAA still has some, but that freedom comes with certain attachments. Deadlines and schedules. Again, this is one that I'm sure everyone's fully aware of. AAA games tend not to slip. There are plenty of examples of AAA games that we can find where the game shipped and it was buggy and it was broken and it never should have shipped. But do you know what? There was a window. It had to go out in that window. There's shareholders to be considered. There's stock prices. There's marketing budgets. Everything's all leading up to that one date, and it cannot be missed in almost any cases. So yeah, in AAA, dates do occasionally ship, but it's pretty rare. Conversely, on the other 99, we had about 3 different release dates where we just realised, hey, we're not going to achieve this. Let's move it. Kept doing it. We had a publisher, but they hadn't invested a huge amount of money into our release date, and they were like, that's cool. Things kept going back. And that actually was really, really lucky for us because it allowed us to take a lot of the pressure off ourselves as a team in terms of the amount of hours we were doing to try and achieve that and the quality of the game that we were working towards. So those dates for sure can't move. What about internal dates though? So with indie, you'll have internal dates that you need to stick to. These would be for things like pitching. Maybe you're pitching to an investor. The game has to be at a certain state by that time. That's a hard, non-movable date because you need them more than they need you. At AAA, you have a lot of internal dates like alpha and beta and things like that. Those things tend to move a bit more. They're a bit more fluid. I actually think in AAA, those things are more fluid than they are in indie. So the internal dates are usually okay. It's those external dates that you really need to be careful of. Budgets. So, spoke about it earlier on. Our indie budget was in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. And that may sound like a lot of money, but actually when you have 10 people, whatever it is on the payroll, that money goes really fast. I think people will be surprised just how quickly that ends up going. And that means that every decision is significant. Every budgetary decision you make is really significant. So in Burning Arrow, we wanted to go out and see our publisher. We wanted to take our game with us and be like, let's sit in a room together and let's work on the design and work out exactly what we're going to ship and when we're going to ship it. And we wanted to send all of us out there. And that was a real tough decision for us. Do we invest what essentially is going to be like a month's salary for another employee? We're going to lose like a month of an artist maybe so that we can go and meet this publisher. Is that worthwhile? And you're constantly making those decisions because of your budget being much smaller. And that kind of knocks onto the staff that you're hiring as well. As I talked about, lots of people wear lots of different hats in indie. Your hired staff will have to wear a lot more hats. The people who are coming in to work for you, they're going to be mucking in with things like business plans and stuff like that. 5 minutes? Sweet. You're going to, kind of more obvious things, you're going to be leaning on pre-built assets a lot more than you are in AAA where you can build everything bespoke. There's a limited time for prototyping. So this is something that I wasn't prepared for. In AAA, we prototype a lot. We hedge all of our bets. We're looking at every decision we make in the game, every core gameplay mechanic, and we're like, is this fun? Is this going to work? How can we improve this early before we go into full production and engage loads of people? In indie, you don't necessarily have the money or the time to do that. Most of our prototyping actually happened before we got investment. When we went to an investor and we said, hey, we've got this game, we want to make it, we think it's good, we think it's worthwhile, and they gave us the money, they expected us to then deliver on the plan that we put in front of them. There wasn't the room to maneuver that AAA would have given us in terms of our design. And one thing I did want to call out actually, so on our game, we actually used some unpaid students for concept and some composing, and that is a decision that I'm not entirely sure that I now agree with. It's obviously a hot topic about should or shouldn't use unpaid people in the games industry these days. I'm not entirely sure where I stand on that, but it's certainly something I'd reconsider if I did it again. But when you're in that situation, you have limited money and someone says, we can add this to your game, and you can lean on things like students and stuff, it's hard to turn that down. It's a real kind of ethical dilemma that you're making running this studio. So Crunch is one that I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about. So obviously everyone knows about Crunch. Everyone's heard about certain big games companies in the industry lately. We crunched a lot on our game. Even though, as I said, we could move dates, we still ended up crunching. A lot of that was down to our mismanagement of time. We were new to the industry. We didn't know how to scope properly. We didn't know how to cut our product back properly. We ended up crunching. And actually, that hurt our product a lot. The amount of time that we spent down in the trenches trying to get it done meant that we didn't take the time to step back and look at the overall product and be like, is this good enough? AAA, you don't have that problem. You have people like producers whose job it is to be doing that all the time. And so actually, overall quality of the product in AAA is a lot easier to gauge because you have those people in those roles that are specifically meant to be doing that. And then resources, kind of touched on this in budgets. Just quickly skim through this one. So, in indie, maybe you need dev kits because you're shipping on a console, but you're not going to have a dev kit per desk. Maybe you want the top-end PCs, but actually you can't afford them. You can't afford 3 or 4 monitor setups, those kinds of things. Whereas in AAA, those things are a lot, you take them for granted, but they're a lot easier. My setup at work is ridiculous. Completely far more than I need, but I'm not going to tell them that. Much better than it was in indie, and that is definitely a real benefit. Cool, so I was going to spend more time on those. I don't have a summary slide, but that's sort of my brain dump of stuff. I hope it was interesting and useful. Does anyone have any questions? That guy.
So, seeing as you've worked both in the AAA industry and the indie one,
Yeah.
which would you say you gained most experience from?
Well, I gained much broader experience in indie. Something which was super useful when I started in AAA, and people are talking about, why can't we do this, why can't we do that? I'm more likely to know the answer because I've touched all those other areas. So I guess just by sheer breadth and being immersed in what I was doing, I think I'd say I got more experience from indie. But I'm a much better programmer now because of my AAA time. My programming leveled up so much quicker in AAA than it did in indie. But like I say, the sheer breadth, I think, outweighs that in indie, in my opinion. Anyone else?
If you start an indie company again, how would you start? Like, what would the first things you'd start to do to go back into it?
As in, what would I do differently?
Yeah.
I would make a much smaller game. Much smaller. Scoping. People as students, people say, I remember when I was a student, people were like, you're always going to overscope stuff, you're always going to try and make it too big. And it's literally true. And they say, cut 50% off and you'll probably still be too big. And that's literally true as well. If I was doing it again, I would make such a smaller, more focused product, but I would be looking at what's the minimum viable thing I can make that I could get out the door that would be interesting and compelling, but that I can build on later and make better. So I wouldn't be trying to make this fast game. I would be making something, not just something smaller. I'd be like, what's the smallest part of that I can then make that I can polish and get to a good level and it can still be fun. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Anyone else?
Did you do much prototyping with the indie side?
We did. We did quite a bit of prototyping. But as I mentioned, as soon as we got investment and we went to our investors and we said, here's our business plan for the product we're going to make, at that point, they expected us to know what the game was. And so from that point onwards, prototyping kind of went out the window a little bit. So yeah, we did a load of prototyping to be like, what game do we want to make? And building designs around that and trying loads of different things out. But yeah, it was that phase and then it stopped.
Did you use the prototype to get to something?
Yes, we did. So one of our prototypes, we felt like we were onto a winner with one of our prototypes. So we fleshed it out a bit more into an experience, and then we went out and pitched that to publishers and investors. And that was what ultimately got our investment. Okay, thank you very much.